She gave birth while he slept with his mistress. She left divorce papers on the bed and disappeared forever. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. Before we begin, please let me ask you from the depths of my heart, how are you, my love? How's your health, your mind, your heart? You are not just part of this channel. You are the soul of it. I care about you. I carry you in my spirit every single day. If you're here, please say, I'm here in the comments and like this video, not for numbers, but so I know my voice still reaches the hearts I love the most. You are my strength, my light, my reason to keep telling stories filled with love and truth. I'm grateful for you beyond words. Now please receive this humble prayer from me to you. May your heart be hugged by peace. May every silent struggle be replaced with quiet strength. May your family be wrapped in protection and your soul lit by love that never fades. You are seen, you are cherished, and you are forever part of me. Let's begin side by side, in love, as one family. The rain pounded against the half-finished glass facade of what would become the Lakeside Cultural Center, Chicago's most anticipated architectural project in a decade. Keely Steele stood beneath the inadequate shelter of a temporary overhang, her tailored charcoal suit already damp at the shoulders, watching men in expensive raincoats compromise her vision, one decision at a time. "Absolutely not," she said, her voice carrying over the drumming downpour. The supporting beams were designed at that precise angle to catch the morning light across the community space. Shifting them even 4 degrees destroys the entire concept. The site manager exchanged uncomfortable glances with the developer's representative. "Miss Steele, the adjusted specs were approved last week by Mr. Thornton himself." "Then unapprove them," Keely said, pulling out her tablet despite the rain. Water droplets splattered across the screen as she brought up her original renderings. This design won the international competition. This is what the city approved, not whatever cost-cutting measure Henderson Development is trying to slide past me. The developer's man, young, nervous, clearly out of his depth, shifted uneasily. "Our structural engineers have concerns about..." "Your structural engineers signed off on my specifications 6 months ago," Keely interrupted, feeling the familiar heat rising in her chest. At 32, she had fought too hard to establish herself in a field dominated by men who viewed her work as decorative rather than revolutionary. "If there are suddenly new concerns, I suggest you have them contact me directly instead of making decisions that fundamentally alter my design." The site manager looked past her shoulder, relief washing over his face. "Mr. Smiths is here. Perhaps he can clarify the company's position." Keely turned, already bristling at the familiar tactic of bringing in legal counsel to intimidate her. Through the curtain of rain, she watched a tall figure approaching, moving with unhurried confidence, despite the downpour. He carried no umbrella, seeming indifferent to the water darkening his obviously expensive suit. Something about his deliberate pace set off warning signals in her mind. When Douglas Smiths reached their small group, Keely was struck first by his height. He towered over her 5'7" frame, and then by eyes the precise grey-blue of Lake Michigan in winter. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead by rain, yet somehow the dishevelment only enhanced his sharp features. "Miss Steele," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that matched his confident demeanor. "Douglas Smiths, Chief Counsel for Henderson Development. I understand there's a disagreement about the structural modifications." "There's no disagreement," Keely responded, holding his gaze directly. "There's my design, which won the competition, secured the funding, and received all necessary approvals. And there's whatever bastardized version Henderson is attempting to substitute without my consent, which violates both my contract and the city's requirements." A flicker of something that might have been admiration crossed his face before it settled back into professional detachment. I've reviewed your contract thoroughly, Ms. Steele. Section 12.4 allows for reasonable structural adjustments as deemed necessary by qualified engineers. And Section 16.2 states that any modifications affecting the aesthetic or functional integrity of the primary design elements require my written approval. She countered without hesitation. I've memorized every line of that contract, Mr. Smiths. The question isn't what's legal. It's whether Henderson Development wants to be known as the company that gutted Chicago's most innovative public project in years to save on materials. Instead of the dismissive response she expected, Douglas Smiths studied her for a long, unnerving moment. Rain tracked down his face like tears, but his intense focus never wavered. "Walk me through the specific concerns," he finally said, gesturing toward the building. "Show me exactly what's been altered." For the next 40 minutes, Keeley led him through the half-constructed building, pointing out each deviation from her plans, explaining the purpose behind every angle and material choice. Douglas asked incisive questions that revealed a surprising understanding of architectural principles. He touched the exposed beams, traced sightlines with his hand, and listened with unexpected attention to her passionate explanations. The entire concept centers on creating a space that transforms throughout the day as light moves across it, she explained, as they stood in what would become the main atrium. These beams, she pointed upward, cast specific shadow patterns that connect to the floor inlays. It's not decorative, it's functional. It guides visitor flow and creates gathering spaces that change with the hours. Like a modern Stonehenge, Douglas murmured, looking up through the skeletal framework to the rain-dark sky. The observation startled her. "Exactly," she said, studying him with new interest. "Most people don't make that connection." "Most people lack imagination," he replied, meeting her eyes. Something electric passed between them, a current of unexpected recognition. As they completed the tour, the rain softened to a gentle mist. Standing at the building's east entrance, Douglas pulled out his phone. "Give me your direct number," he said, his tone making it not quite a request but not fully a demand. "Why?" Keeley asked, even as she found herself reciting the digits. "Because I'm going to fix this," he said simply, typing her number into his contacts. "You'll have revised instructions by tomorrow morning requiring full adherence to your original specifications." "Just like that?" Keeley couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "Henderson has been fighting me on costs since breaking ground." Douglas's mouth curved in a smile that transformed his severe features. "Just like that, Henderson hired me because I win battles, Miss Steele. This one happens to be worth fighting for the right side." The intensity in his gaze made her momentarily forget the chill of her damp clothes. "Thank you," she said, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "But I have to ask, why?" Most corporate attorneys I've encountered would be finding ways to enforce those contract loopholes. Not close to them. Douglas looked back at the half-finished building, something unreadable crossing his features. "Because you were right about one thing. This building will be a landmark, and because I've spent 15 years protecting corporate interests." His eyes returned to hers. "It might be interesting to protect something beautiful for a change." The word lingered between them, laden with meaning that extended beyond architecture. 3 weeks later, Keeley looked up from her drafting table to find Douglas Smiths standing in the doorway of her studio. The construction was back on track, exactly as she'd designed it, but she hadn't heard directly from him since that rainy day. "Your assistant let me in," he said, taking in the organized chaos of her workspace, models, drawings, material samples, covering every surface. "I was in the neighborhood for a meeting and thought I'd deliver the news in person. The City Planning Commission has approved the additional funding to cover the original materials you specified." Keeley set down her pencil. "That's unexpected. The budget increase request has been stalled for months." The commission needed some legal clarification about the terms of the original proposal, Douglas said, the slight quirk of his lips revealing his understated pride. Once I provided that clarification, they were quite cooperative. "You went before the planning commission for me?" Keeley asked, genuinely surprised. "That's well beyond resolving an on-site construction dispute." Douglas moved further into the studio, studying a detailed model of the cultural center. The dispute and the funding were connected issues. Solving one meant addressing the other. His fingers hovered over the delicate structure without touching it. "This is extraordinary work, Keeley." The casual use of her first name should have bothered her, but instead it sent a warm current through her chest. "Thank you, Douglas." His eyes met hers over the model, and that same electric recognition passed between them. "Have dinner with me," he said, the words somewhere between a question and a statement. Professional warning bells sounded in Keeley's mind. "I don't mix business with pleasure," she said, the response automatic. "The business is concluded," Douglas replied without hesitation. "Your design is protected, the funding is approved, and the construction company has signed new compliance agreements. There's nothing more for me to do professionally." He maintained a respectful distance, but his gaze was unwavering. Dinner would be entirely personal. Keeley studied him, trying to reconcile the corporate attorney who had appeared so formidable with the man who had fought for her vision with unexpected passion. "Why me?" she asked bluntly. "Chicago is full of beautiful, accomplished women who probably don't challenge everything you say." Douglas's laugh was unexpected, rich and genuine. "That's precisely why," he said. "Do you know how rare it is to meet someone who sees the world entirely on their own terms, who fights for their vision without compromise?" He moved closer, close enough that she could smell his subtle cologne. "You fascinate me, Keeley Steele. Have dinner with me and tell me how you became the woman who stands in the rain, arguing about light patterns and shadow trajectories." Against every practical instinct, Keeley found herself saying yes. Dinner at an intimate restaurant overlooking the lake turned into a conversation that stretched until the staff began stacking chairs. They discovered unexpected connections. Both had lost parents young. Both had fought their way through prestigious schools on scholarships and determination. Douglas described growing up with the crushing expectations of succeeding his father's failed ambitions, while Keeley shared her experience of bouncing through foster homes after her parents' car accident. "Architecture became my way of creating permanence," she explained as they walked along the lakefront afterward, the city lights reflecting on the dark water. "Designing spaces where people feel secure, connected, part of something lasting." "And you?" she asked, genuinely curious. "How does someone with your obvious intelligence and perception end up defending development companies, trying to cut corners?" Douglas was quiet for a moment, his pace slowing. "The simple answer is that I'm good at it. The real answer," he looked out over the water, "I grew up with nothing stable, financially or otherwise. Security became my religion. Corporate law offered that security. But not satisfaction," Keeley observed. His eyes found hers, surprisingly vulnerable. "No, not until recently." The admission hung between them as they stopped walking, facing each other in the gentle spring night. Without planning or hesitation, Keeley reached up and touched his face, drawn by something she couldn't name. Douglas caught her hand against his cheek, turning to press his lips gently against her palm. A gesture so intimate, it sent shivers through her body. "I've never met anyone like you," he whispered against her skin. When they finally kissed, the connection felt inevitable, as if they were completing a circuit that had been waiting to be closed since that first rain-soaked meeting. His arms encircled her with restrained strength, and Keeley felt something inside her unfold, reaching toward him with a yearning that both thrilled and terrified her. Their courthouse wedding 6 months later was as unconventional as their meeting. Keely wore a vintage gold dress that caught the light as she walked toward Douglas, who stood waiting with an expression of such naked emotion that she felt it like a physical touch. When she reached him, she saw something she had never expected. Tears streaming unashamedly down the face of this powerful man as he took her hands in his. "I didn't expect to cry," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I did," she replied with a smile, reaching up to brush the tears from his cheeks. "You feel things more deeply than you let people see." The simple ceremony joined them legally, but it was their whispered vows on a Santorini cliffside villa that truly sealed their union. Tangled in white sheets as Mediterranean moonlight washed over them, Douglas traced the constellation of freckles across her shoulders with reverent fingers. "You've rebuilt me, Keely," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder and gratitude. "Everything I am now belongs to you." In that perfect stolen moment, with the sea air drifting through open windows and their bodies still humming with passion, Keely Steele believed in permanent things, in foundations that wouldn't crumble, in promises that wouldn't break, in a love that had transformed both the architect and the man she had rebuilt with her belief in him. She couldn't have known then that the arms holding her so reverently would be the same ones that would shatter her world completely. In that perfect stolen moment by the Aegean Sea, the future was still unwritten, full of promise and the intoxicating discovery of finding your perfect counterpoint in another soul. Chapter 2. Fault Lines. 3 years into their marriage, success pulled them in different directions. Keely stood at the window of their penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline, her hand absently tracing the subtle curve of her belly beneath her silk robe. 6 months pregnant with a child the doctors had once told her she might never conceive, she still found herself marveling at the miracle growing within her. "Are you still awake?" she called, hearing Douglas moving in their bedroom. It was nearly midnight, and he'd come home only 20 minutes earlier, briefcase heavy with documents from what he'd described as the case that could define my career. "Just reviewing some depositions," he answered, his voice carrying that edge of distraction she'd grown increasingly familiar with over the past months. Keely moved from the window to the kitchen, warming milk with honey and cinnamon, her nightly ritual to calm the baby's evening acrobatics. The spacious apartment gleamed with the evidence of their shared success, her prestigious Pritzker Architecture Prize displayed alongside his law journal publications, photographs from their travels, the handcrafted furniture she'd designed for their home. Through the open bedroom door, she could see Douglas sitting against the headboard, papers spread across the Egyptian cotton sheets, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. Even after 3 years, the sight of him still stirred something primal within her, his strong jawline, the intensity of concentration that drew his brows together, the powerful hands that could move with such surprising gentleness across her skin. "The baby's active tonight," she said, carrying her warm milk to the bedroom. "Do you want to feel?" Douglas looked up, blinking as if emerging from deep water. For a moment, she glimpsed something like reluctance cross his features before he set the papers aside. "Of course," he said, reaching for her as she sat beside him, his hands spread across the taut skin of her belly, warm and steady. When the baby kicked against his palm, his expression softened into genuine wonder. "That's incredible," he murmured, the distraction momentarily banished from his eyes. "Do you think it's a boy or girl?" "I still want to be surprised," Keely said, covering his hand with her own. "But I've been dreaming about a son, a little boy with your eyes and my stubborn chin." Douglas smiled, leaning forward to kiss her gently. "Poor kid won't stand a chance with both our stubborn genes." For that brief moment, they were connected as they had been in the beginning, present, attuned, existing in the same emotional space. Then his phone vibrated on the nightstand, and the spell broke. Douglas's eyes flickered toward it, a nearly imperceptible movement that nonetheless sent a cold ripple through Keely's contentment. "It's almost midnight," she said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "Surely the deposition can wait until morning." "It's probably just the paralegal with those precedent cases I asked for," Douglas replied, already reaching for the phone. As he read the message, his expression changed subtly, a tightening around his eyes, a slight flush across his cheekbones. "I need to make a quick call," he said, already rising from the bed. "Some confusion about tomorrow's schedule." Keely watched him walk to his home office, closing the door behind him, something he'd never done during their first 2 years together. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if sensing her sudden disquiet. Across town, in her sleek downtown apartment, Rebecca Winters waited for Douglas's call, knowing he would need to find a private moment away from his pregnant wife. She glanced at herself in the mirror, her coolly elegant beauty a deliberate construction, from her precisely cut blonde hair to her expensive silk pajamas. At 36, Rebecca had perfected the art of calculated attraction. Unlike the warm, vibrant beauty of Keely Steele, Rebecca's allure lay in her inaccessibility, the cool detachment that made men desperate to breach her defenses, the clinical precision with which she assessed and exploited weaknesses. When her phone finally rang, she answered on the second ring. "I was beginning to think you weren't going to call," she said, her voice deliberately low. "I told you not to text after 11, Douglas replied, his voice tight with both irritation and poorly concealed desire. "Keely's still awake." "I thought you said she's been falling asleep early since the pregnancy," Rebecca countered, enjoying the power of making him uncomfortable. "Besides, I have the Thornton files ready for review before tomorrow's meeting, purely professional." Silence told her he was wrestling with the same conflict he'd been fighting for the past 3 months, since the night they'd worked late on the billionaire Thornton's antitrust case and ended up pressed against his office wall. Her skirt hitched around her waist, his wedding ring cold against her skin. "I'll meet you at 7 tomorrow to review them," he finally said. "The usual place." The usual place was the private meeting room at the downtown Sentinel Hotel, where their professional consultations had gradually evolved into lingering touches, tense silences, and finally, the full-blown affair that now consumed Douglas like an addiction. "Wear the blue dress," he added in a lower voice, the note of command sending a thrill through her. "The one from Milan." After disconnecting, Rebecca poured herself a glass of wine, satisfaction curling through her. Douglas Smith's brilliant, controlled, the youngest senior partner in the firm's history, was becoming increasingly careless in his obsession with her. She'd known from the beginning that he would eventually slip, that the pristine life he'd built with his talented, pregnant wife would develop fractures under the strain of their deception. Rebecca didn't analyze her own motives too closely. She enjoyed the challenge of Douglas, the complexity of his divided loyalty. She wasn't looking for love or even a relationship, just the intoxicating power of being desired beyond reason, beyond ethics, beyond his own carefully constructed identity. In the nursery of their penthouse, Keely sat in the rocking chair Douglas had surprised her with on her birthday, her fingers tracing the constellation map she'd painted on the ceiling, stars arranged exactly as they had been on the night they'd met. She'd created this room with such hope, each element designed to tell their child the story of love that had created them. The mobile hanging above the handcrafted crib featured miniature architectural landmarks significant to their relationship. The cultural center where they'd first met, the restaurant where they'd had their first date, the Santorini villa where they'd honeymooned, the courthouse where they'd married. Keely's architectural firm had flourished over the past 3 years, her sustainable community designs earning international recognition. The pregnancy had slowed her travel, but not her creativity. She was currently finalizing plans for her most ambitious project yet, a mixed-income housing development that incorporated green spaces and community facilities. Yet, as her professional success grew, the distance between her and Douglas had been expanding in subtle increments. It had started with the Thornton case 6 months ago. Longer hours, missed doctor appointments, distracted conversations. She'd attributed it to the pressure of the high-profile litigation, to his ambition, to the natural adjustments of preparing for parenthood. But lately other signs had emerged. The faint scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his shirts despite the dry cleaning, the secretive phone calls, the vague explanations for late nights that didn't quite align with the firm's billing system she'd glimpsed on his laptop. Her phone chimed with a calendar reminder. Tomorrow's ultrasound appointment, the one Douglas had promised not to miss after being absent for the last 2. She texted him a gentle reminder, watching the screen until the message marked as "read," but receiving no response. Keely wasn't naive. She recognized the classic signs of infidelity, yet something in her refused to fully acknowledge the possibility that Douglas, who had pursued her with such single-minded devotion, who had held her through the devastation of an early miscarriage 2 years ago, who still sometimes looked at her with that disbelieving wonder, could betray everything they'd built together. At her desk, a framed photograph caught her attention. Douglas, kneeling beside her at the construction site of her community center, his hand proudly placed on the cornerstone, his eyes not on the camera, but on her, filled with unmistakable adoration. The date on the cornerstone read just 8 months earlier, but the man in that photograph seemed increasingly distant from the distracted stranger who now shared their home. 3 days later, Keely decided to surprise Douglas at his office with dinner, knowing he'd been working late nights on trial preparation. When she arrived at Montgomery and Reed, the receptionist had already left for the evening, allowing Keely to make her way to Douglas's corner office, unannounced. As she approached the partially open door, she heard voices within. Douglas and a woman, their tones too low to distinguish words, but with an unmistakable intimacy that stopped Keely in her tracks. She hesitated, suddenly uncertain, the takeout containers warm in her hands. When she finally pushed the door wider, Douglas was alone, standing by the window with his back to her. But the lingering scent of an unfamiliar perfume hung in the air, and a woman's silk scarf lay draped over the arm of his visitor's chair. "Keely!" His surprise seemed excessive for a simple, unexpected visit, his eyes darting to the scarf before returning to her face. "What are you doing here?" "I brought dinner," she said, holding up the bags with forced lightness. "I thought you might be hungry after working so late." "That's very thoughtful," he replied, moving to intercept her before she could fully enter the room. "But I'm about to leave for court, a last-minute hearing on the Thornton case." The explanation was plausible, but something in his eyes, a flicker of guilt, a shadow of evasion, planted the first true seed of doubt in Keely's heart. As he ushered her back toward the elevator, claiming he would walk her to her car, she caught sight of a tall, blonde woman slipping from the adjacent conference room into the hallway, adjusting the collar of her blouse with practiced nonchalance. Douglas's gaze never wavered from Keely, but his body tensed slightly, a nearly imperceptible tell that she might have missed if she hadn't been watching for it. In that moment, as the blonde woman disappeared around a corner, Keely felt the first hairline fracture in the foundation of their marriage, small but significant, a fault line that would eventually threaten everything they had built together. The baby kicked sharply as they rode the elevator down, and Keely placed a protective hand over her belly. Douglas noticed the gesture and covered her hand with his own, his touch gentle but his eyes avoiding hers. "I promise I won't miss tomorrow's ultrasound," he said, clearly attempting to divert her attention. "I've cleared my entire morning." Keely nodded, allowing him this deflection while storing away the memory of his guilty expression, the woman's casually adjusted clothing, the deliberate way he had prevented her from fully entering his office. These were pieces of a puzzle she wasn't yet ready to complete, fragments of a truth that would require all her courage to eventually face. That night, as Douglas slept beside her, his body close but his mind clearly elsewhere even in slumber, Keely stared at the ceiling and acknowledged what part of her had suspected for months. The man who had promised her everything was leading a double life, creating parallel fault lines that would eventually cause their carefully constructed world to collapse. Chapter 3. The Perfect Storm. The sky over Chicago had been threatening all day, dark clouds gathering like bruises above the cityscape. By afternoon, meteorologists were tracking what they called a significant weather system, the understated term for the most severe spring storm to hit the city in decades. Keely stood at the window of her office, watching lightning fracture the darkening sky. At 8 months pregnant, her body felt heavy and unfamiliar, the baby restless within her as if sensing the electricity in the air. She pressed a hand against the small of her back, where an intermittent ache had been troubling her since morning. "You should head home before this hits," said Marie, her assistant, appearing at the door with concern etched on her face. "They're saying power outages are likely, and the wind's already taking down branches near the lake." Keely nodded, glancing at her watch. It was only 3 o'clock, but the sky had darkened to twilight levels. "I need to finish these revisions for tomorrow's presentation," she said, gesturing toward her drafting table, where the final designs for her sustainable housing complex lay spread out. "Douglas will be worried," Marie said gently, knowing how to appeal to her boss's practical side. Keely didn't correct her. The truth was, Douglas had been so consumed with the Thornton case that she doubted he'd noticed the weather at all. Just that morning, he'd left before dawn, kissing her forehead while she pretended to sleep, whispering something about depositions running late. "You're right," Keely conceded, beginning to gather her materials. "I can work from home if the power stays on." By the time she reached their building, the first heavy drops were beginning to fall. The doorman helped her from the car, holding an umbrella that immediately inverted in the strengthening wind. In the elevator, Keely felt another twinge, sharper this time, radiating across her lower abdomen. She breathed through it, dismissing it as Braxton Hicks. The false contractions her doctor had warned were common in the 3rd trimester. The penthouse was dark and empty when she arrived. Keely moved through the space, turning on lamps, creating pools of warm light against the gathering gloom outside. Thunder rumbled, close enough to vibrate the windows, and the baby responded with a forceful kick that made her gasp. "It's just a storm," she murmured, rubbing circles over her belly. "Nothing to worry about." She tried Douglas's cell phone, wanting to hear his voice, to share the odd vulnerability she felt as the storm encircled their home. The call went straight to voicemail. "Hey, it's me," she said, keeping her tone light. "Just checking when you'll be home. The storm's getting serious. They're talking about flash flooding downtown. Call me when you can." In the kitchen, Keely assembled a plate of cheese and fruit, suddenly ravenous. Another pain gripped her as she reached for a glass. This one strong enough to make her clutch the counter for support. When it passed, a new sensation replaced it, a warm trickle down her inner thigh. Her water had broken. For a moment, Keely stood frozen, mental calculations racing. 6 weeks early, earlier than expected, though not dangerously so. Douglas was unreachable. The storm was intensifying by the minute. Emergency services already stretched thin across the city. With practiced calm, she moved to the bedroom and retrieved the hospital bag she'd packed the previous weekend. Another contraction seized her, stronger than the last, forcing her to lean against the wall until it subsided. They were coming too quickly for early labor. She called Douglas again. Voicemail. This time she couldn't keep the urgency from her voice. "Douglas, my water broke. The baby's coming early. I'm calling an Uber to Northwestern Memorial. Please meet me there as soon as you can." The streets were already flooding when her rideshare arrived. The normally 20-minute drive to the hospital took 45 minutes, each contraction building in intensity as they navigated detours around fallen trees and darkened traffic. Signals. Keely called Douglas 4 more times during the journey. Each call went unanswered. Across town at the Peninsula Hotel, Douglas Smith stood at the rain-lashed window of Suite 1742, a tumbler of Macallan 18 in his hand. Behind him, Rebecca reclined against the pillows of the king-sized bed, the sheets draped artfully across her naked body. "You're distracted today," she observed, her voice holding the slight edge it always did when his attention wandered from her. "The great Douglas Smith's, a million miles away in the middle of our special afternoon." He didn't turn from the window. "The Thornton hearings tomorrow. There's still the matter of those offshore accounts the prosecution might bring up." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The Thornton case was proceeding exactly as Douglas had orchestrated, the prosecution floundering against his meticulous strategy, the judge already leaning in their favor. His distraction had nothing to do with work. The truth was more complicated, more shameful. This morning, he'd felt his unborn child kick against his hand as Keely slept, and for the first time since beginning this affair, the full weight of his betrayal had crashed through his carefully maintained compartmentalization. His phone vibrated in his discarded jacket across the room. The custom tone indicated it was Keely calling. "Again, aren't you going to answer that?" Rebecca asked, making no effort to hide her irritation. "That's the 5th time she's called in an hour." "I'll call her back later," Douglas said, taking a long swallow of his scotch. "I told her I'd be in depositions until late." Rebecca rose from the bed, not bothering with modesty, as she approached him. At 36, she was all sleek confidence, her body a weapon she wielded with precision. She pressed against his back, her hands sliding around to loosen his tie. "Turn it off," she murmured against his shoulder. "I didn't arrange my schedule and book this suite for you to spend our time thinking about your pregnant wife." The cruelty in her words sent a cold ripple through Douglas, but he found himself reaching for his phone and silencing it completely. Something in Rebecca's demanding presence made him reckless, willing to risk the life he'd built for moments of transgressive escape. "It's nothing that can't wait until morning," he told her, the words that would haunt him for years to come falling carelessly from his lips. Outside, lightning split the sky directly overhead, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The hotel lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized. "Come back to bed," Rebecca said, leading him by his loosened tie. "The storm's just getting started." In the labor and delivery wing of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Keely gripped the rails of the hospital bed as another contraction tore through her body. The monitor beside her beeped steadily, tracking the baby's heartbeat, which occasionally dipped during the strongest contractions. "You're doing great, Miss Steele," the nurse said, checking the readout. "You're already 7 centimeters dilated. This little one is definitely in a hurry." Keely nodded, unable to speak until the contraction passed. When it finally eased, she reached again for her phone. No missed calls, no texts. Douglas's continued silence was becoming something worse than worrying. It was becoming suspicious. "Is there someone else we can call for you?" asked the nurse, her expression compassionate. "Your labor is progressing quickly, and with the baby coming early." "I've left messages for my husband," Keely said, her voice tight with more than physical pain. "He's in depositions for an important case. He'll be here soon." The nurse nodded, though something in her eyes suggested she'd heard similar assurances from other women laboring alone. "I'm going to ask the doctor to check on you." "Again," she said, "the baby's heart rate is a little irregular during contractions. Nothing too concerning yet, but we want to keep a close eye on it." Left alone momentarily, Keely tried Douglas one more time. When the call connected to voicemail, something broke inside her, a dam of denial she'd been building for months. "Douglas," she said, her voice calm despite the tears streaming down her face, "I'm in active labor at Northwestern. The baby's coming tonight, and there's some concern about his heart rate. I know you're not in depositions. I know something's been happening for months now. But this is your child being born. Whatever else is happening, please, don't miss this. As she disconnected, the door opened. Instead of the nurse, a familiar face appeared. Justine Wu, a hospital volunteer whom Keely recognized from Douglas's firm. They had met at several company functions. "Keely? Oh my God, you're in labor," Justine exclaimed, looking stunned. "I just came to bring my sister some things. She had her baby yesterday. Are you okay? Where's Douglas?" "He's on his way," Keely said automatically, the lie bitter on her tongue. "He's just wrapping up some work on the Thornton case." Justine's expression shifted subtly, confusion replacing surprise. The moment stretched as Keely breathed through another contraction beginning to build. "Keely," Justine said hesitantly when the pain had passed, "I probably shouldn't say anything, but I saw Douglas about an hour ago at the Peninsula Hotel with Rebecca Winters." The monitor beside the bed registered a sudden spike in Keely's heart rate. The nurse rushed in, alarmed by the change. "What's happening?" she asked, quickly checking Keely's vitals. "Nothing," Keely said, her voice unnaturally calm. "Could you please give us a minute? My friend has an important message for my husband." When the nurse had reluctantly stepped outside, Keely turned to Justine. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Justine twisted her hands together, clearly regretting her impulsive revelation. "I was meeting a client in the lobby. I saw them going into the elevator together. He had his hand on her lower back. They looked intimate." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, confirming every suspicion, every doubt, every instinct Keely had been fighting to ignore. As another contraction built, she reached for her phone one last time, not to call Douglas but her attorney. "Justine," she said through gritted teeth as the pain peaked, "I need one more favor. Could you find the hospital gift shop and get me a Polaroid camera? And I need you to witness something for me." 3 hours later, as the storm reached its violent crescendo over Chicago, Henry Steele entered the world. 5 pounds, 8 ounces, with a powerful cry and his father's steel blue eyes. The labor nurse placed him on Keely's chest. This tiny miracle they'd warned might never happen. "He's perfect," Keely whispered, counting his fingers, his toes, memorizing the curve of his miniature ears, the bow of his lips. "Everything's going to be okay, Henry. I promise." As she held her son for the first time, something crystallized within Keely Steele, a clarity of purpose, a steel-tempered resolve. By morning, when the storm had passed, leaving destruction in its wake, Keely's plan was fully formed. The divorce papers would be ready by noon. The hotel keycard Justine had retrieved from the front desk with a well-crafted story would provide access. The Polaroid of newborn Henry would be the only glimpse Douglas Smiths would have of his son for many years to come. By the time Douglas finally checked his messages at dawn, it would be too late. While he had been creating memories of betrayal, she had been creating life. While he had been losing his soul, she had been finding her strength. The storm had changed everything. And in its aftermath, Keely and Henry would vanish like lightning, brilliant, powerful, and gone without a trace. Chapter 4. The Unmaking. Morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Suite 1742 at the Peninsula Hotel, casting soft shadows across the rumpled bedsheets. Douglas stirred, his arm reaching instinctively for the warm body that had been beside him hours earlier. The space was empty, the sheets cool. Rebecca had left some time before dawn. She always did, slipping away like a beautiful apparition, leaving only the ghost of her perfume on the pillowcase. For a moment, Douglas lingered in the hazy space between sleep and wakefulness, the familiar weight of guilt not yet fully settled on his chest. Then reality crashed in as he reached for his phone and saw the screen. 17 missed calls from Keely, 5 voicemails, and a string of text messages spanning the past 12 hours. His heart stuttered as he played the first voicemail. "Hey, it's me, just checking when you'll be home. The storm's getting serious." The second, "Douglas, my water broke, the baby's coming early. I'm calling an Uber to Northwestern Memorial." By the third message, Keely's voice had changed, the controlled panic giving way to something harder, more resolved. "I'm inactive. Labor at Northwestern. The baby's coming tonight, and there's some concern about his heart rate. I know you're not in depositions." Douglas was already pulling on his clothes, his hands shaking so badly he could barely manage the buttons of his shirt. The final voicemail had been left at 3:47 a.m. from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Smiths, this is Nurse Abernathy from Northwestern Memorial. Your wife requested I inform you that she has delivered a healthy baby boy at 3:26 this morning. Both mother and child are stable. No mention of Keely wanting to see him. No warmth in the nurse's professional tone, just clinical information delivered as a courtesy." As Douglas rushed from the hotel room, he failed to notice the hotel envelope that had been slipped under his door during the night. It would be hours before he returned to discover it, hours in which his entire world would unravel beyond repair. In a private hospital room, Keely sat propped against pillows, watching newborn Henry sleep in the clear bassinet beside her bed. Despite the physical exhaustion of labor, her mind was crystalline in its clarity, focused on the sequence of events she had set in motion during the night. Between contractions, she had called her attorney, Martin Goldman, whose daughter she had once mentored in architecture school. Martin had been appalled at the timing, but moved by her situation. By dawn, he had prepared preliminary divorce papers, which now waited in a sealed envelope with a hotel employee at the peninsula, along with very specific instructions for delivery. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. Justine Wu entered, her expression a mixture of compassion and discomfort. "It's done," Justine said quietly. "The envelope will be delivered to the room at noon, exactly as you asked. I spoke with the head of housekeeping myself." "Thank you," Keely said, her voice steady despite the emotional storm raging beneath her. Composed exterior. "I know this puts you in an awkward position with the firm." Justine shook her head. "What Douglas is doing, puts us all in an awkward position. Rebecca's been flaunting their relationship for weeks to anyone paying attention." She moved closer to the bassinet, looking down at Henry's peaceful face. "He looks like you. Strong." "He'll need to be," Keely said, her hand resting protectively on the plastic side of the bassinet. "Are you sure about this?" Justine asked hesitantly. "Disappearing completely? It's so final." Keely's gaze remained on her son as she answered, "What would you have me do? Stay and become the pitiful wife who forgave the unforgivable? Watch Douglas perform remorse while continuing to see her? Subject Henry to a lifetime of divided loyalty?" She finally looked up, her eyes clear and determined. "I built our home. Justine designed every inch of it to support the family we were creating. Douglas defiled that creation. I won't live in the ruins." Justine nodded, understanding the architect's perspective in a way others might not. "When will you leave?" "This afternoon. My godmother is flying in from Seattle. We'll go directly to O'Hare from here. Everything else has been arranged." Keely reached under her pillow and withdrew a small envelope. "This contains a secure email address, the only way to contact me for the next 6 months. If Douglas does anything desperate or dangerous after he receives the papers, please let me know." As Justine took the envelope, the door opened again. Both women tensed, but it was only a nurse with Henry's medication. "Your husband still hasn't arrived?" the nurse asked, checking Henry's vital signs. "He's been delayed," Keely replied, the practiced lie coming easily now. Business emergency. The nurse made a disapproving noise, but said nothing further. When she had gone, Keely turned back to Justine. "There's one more thing," she said, her voice lower. "In exactly 11 days, I need you to send this to Douglas's office." She handed over a second envelope, this one sealed with wax. "It contains the details of the offshore account where I've transferred my personal savings, money from before our marriage. He'll need to sign these forms acknowledging the separation of assets. What about the penthouse, your firm, everything else you've built?" A shadow crossed Keely's face, the only visible crack in her composed facade. "I'm walking away from all of it. My assistant has instructions to transfer my clients to my partners. The penthouse can go to Douglas. It's just a shell now anyway." She looked down at Henry, her expression softening. "The only thing that matters is right here. We're starting over with nothing but each other." Justine squeezed her hand before leaving, struck by the extraordinary courage it took to dismantle a life so completely, to sever every tie to the past in a single day. Alone with Henry, Keely finally allowed herself a moment of grief. Silent tears tracked down her face as she memorized the contours of the hospital room, the last place in Chicago she would ever occupy. By nightfall, she and Henry would be on a plane to Seattle, leaving behind no trail for Douglas to follow. The most painful cut had already been made. Whether Douglas knew it yet or not, their marriage had ended the moment he chose Rebecca over his wife and child during the storm. Everything else was just paperwork. At precisely noon, as Douglas frantically searched the maternity ward of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, a hotel employee knocked on the door of Suite 1742 at the Peninsula. Finding no answer, he used his master key to enter, placing the sealed envelope on the center of the unmade bed as instructed. Inside the envelope were 3 items: legal documents dissolving the marriage of Douglas and Keely Smiths, a Polaroid photograph of newborn Henry taken hours after his birth, and a hotel key card. On the back of the photograph, written in Keely's architectural drafting hand, were 7 words: "While you were creating the memory of betrayal, I was creating life." No address for service of response, no contact information, no path back to the wife and child Douglas had betrayed. Just the cold reality of consequences delivered to the very bed where he had destroyed everything that mattered. When Douglas finally returned to the hotel room that afternoon, wild-eyed and desperate after being told Keely had checked out of the hospital against medical advice with no forwarding information, the envelope waited like a silent accusation. His hands trembled as he opened it, the Polaroid falling onto the rumpled sheets first, a tiny perfect face, eyes closed, wrapped in a hospital blanket. His son. The child he had missed being born because he was in this very room with another woman. The divorce papers were comprehensive, already bearing Keely's signature, requiring only his to complete the dissolution of their marriage. The hotel key card gleamed accusingly in the afternoon light. His own card, which he had dropped somewhere in the room during his night with Rebecca, now returned to him as evidence. Douglas sank to his knees beside the bed, the full weight of what he had done, finally crushing the careful compartmentalization he had maintained for months. He reached for his phone to call Keely, but there was no answer. Her number already disconnected, her digital presence already beginning to vanish. By the time he staggered back to their penthouse, frantic for any clue to her whereabouts, the first signs of her methodical erasure were evident. Her clothes gone, her personal artifacts missing, the nursery stripped of the handmade mobile and the constellation map she had painted on the ceiling. She had left the furniture, the appliances, the wedding photographs. Everything purchased with their joint funds remained untouched, a scrupulous division that spoke of careful legal guidance. What she had taken was more essential. Every trace of her heart, every item that carried emotional significance, and most devastatingly, their son. As night fell over Chicago, Douglas Smith's stood. in the center of a home that was no longer a home, holding the photograph of a child he might never know, facing the consequences of choices he could never undo. Keely and Henry were already 30,000 feet above the Midwest, flying toward a new life where Douglas Smith's existed only as a painful chapter in their past, a chapter Keely intended to close permanently. Chapter 5. Vanished without a trace. 3 months after Keely and Henry's disappearance, Douglas stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, bourbon in hand, staring at the Chicago skyline. The city's lights blurred through unshed tears and too much alcohol, mirroring how his once perfect life had dissolved into regret and desperate searching. The apartment remained exactly as Keely had left it, Douglas unable to move her possessions or redecorate the spaces she had designed. The nursery door stayed closed. He couldn't bear to see the empty crib, the half-finished constellation map on the ceiling. Every corner contained memories. Keely laughing in the kitchen, asleep on the sofa with architectural plans across her lap, her face transformed by joy when they'd learned she was pregnant. His phone rang. The private investigator he'd hired, calling with the same lack of progress. "Nothing yet, Mr. Smiths," the man said wearily. "She was thorough. New phone, new email, no social media. The Seattle address for her godmother was a dead end. The woman sold her house 2 years ago. None of Keely's former colleagues have had contact." Douglas tightened his grip on the glass. "What about the hospital records? Birth certificate?" "Filed. Properly, but with restricted access. She's listed Henry's birth name as Henry Steele, not Smith's. She's exercised her legal right to privacy protections as a single mother." "She's not a single mother," Douglas snapped. "She's my wife. Henry is my son." The investigator's silence spoke volumes. Legally, the divorce papers remained unprocessed. Douglas had refused to sign them, but in every practical sense, Keely had engineered a complete severance. "Keep looking," Douglas said finally. "Double your team if necessary. I don't care what it costs." After disconnecting, he moved to his home office, where walls once covered with legal certificates now displayed maps marking possible locations, printouts of travel records, property searches spanning the country. His obsession had consumed everything. His partnership at the firm on hiatus, his reputation in tatters after the public implosion of his marriage. Rebecca had transferred to the London office within weeks of Keely's disappearance, irritated by Douglas's frantic search, unwilling to be cast as the villainess in what had become a notorious scandal in Chicago's legal circles. "Your priorities have clearly shifted," she'd said coldly during their final confrontation. "Call me when you've gotten this domestic crisis out of your system." Douglas hadn't bothered to respond. The woman who had seemed so alluring, so worth risking everything for, now appeared shallow against the void of Keely and Henry's absence. His laptop glowed with dozens of open tabs, public record searches, private investigator reports, real estate transactions under Keely's name. Each night, he performed the same digital ritual, searching for any trace of the woman who had vanished with his child and his heart. The bourbon wasn't helping, but he couldn't stop. The glass was never empty for long, the liquor dulling the edges. Of a pain too sharp to bear sober, his phone rang again. "Unknown number, Smith's," he answered, voice rough from alcohol and lack of sleep. "Douglas." The voice was familiar. Martin Goldman, Keely's attorney. Douglas straightened immediately, spilling bourbon across expensive papers. "Where is she? Is Henry all right?" "They're fine," Goldman said neutrally. "I'm not calling to discuss their whereabouts. I'm calling about the divorce papers you've refused to sign for nearly 3 months. I'm not signing anything until I see my son." Goldman sighed. "Douglas, Keely has no legal obligation to facilitate contact between you and Henry. She's filed for sole custody on grounds of abandonment during medical emergency." The words hit like physical blows. "Abandonment?" I didn't. You were unreachable during your child's birth because you were having an affair. Multiple witnesses have provided statements, including hospital staff and your colleagues. The medical records show you failed to respond to 17 urgent communications while your wife experienced a high-risk delivery. The documented facts support Keely's petition. Douglas sank into his chair. She can't just take my son. I have rights. Rights you'll need to pursue through proper legal channels, Goldman responded evenly. But Keely has relocated to a jurisdiction where her petition is likely to be viewed favorably. She's established a stable home, employment and community for Henry. She's also prepared to introduce evidence regarding your ongoing alcohol dependency should you pursue contested custody. The calculated precision of Keely's legal strategy left Douglas breathless. She had anticipated every move, blocked every path before he even knew the game had begun. I just want to see my son, he said, hating the pleading note in his voice. I need to apologize to Keely. You had your opportunity to choose your family, Douglas. You chose differently. Goldman's voice softened slightly. If you truly care about their well-being, sign the papers. Accept the settlement terms. Seek help. For your drinking, demonstrate over time that you can be a stable presence. That's the only path forward that doesn't subject all of you to years of painful litigation. After disconnecting, Douglas hurled his glass against the wall, watching it shatter into glittering shards, a fitting metaphor for what he had done to his family. 6 months after Keely's disappearance, Douglas's obsession had reached new heights. The drinking had worsened. His partnership was officially suspended after he'd appeared intoxicated in court. Most friends had drifted away, uncomfortable with his fixation on finding Keely and Henry. He had hired and fired 3 sets of private investigators, convinced they weren't trying hard enough. He had traveled to Seattle twice, searching every neighborhood for signs of Keely, showing Henry's photograph to strangers until the police were called. The divorce papers remained unsigned. Douglas clung to the technical legality of their marriage. Like a drowning man to driftwood, the only connection to Keely he had left. It was during one of these dark nights that Douglas hit rock bottom. Driving intoxicated along Lakeshore Drive, he nearly crashed into a guardrail, stopping inches from disaster. As he sat shaking behind the wheel, horns blaring around him, the full measure of his destruction crashed through his remaining defenses. He had lost everything that mattered. His wife, his child, his integrity, his career, his self-respect. And he had lost them not through misfortune or circumstance, but through his own deliberate choices, his own weakness, his own betrayal of everything he claimed to value. The next morning, with hands still trembling from withdrawal, Douglas signed himself into a rehabilitation facility outside Chicago. It was the first step on a long journey toward becoming someone different than the man who had destroyed his family. Someone who might someday deserve a second chance, however unlikely. 1 year after the storm that had changed everything, a manila envelope arrived at Douglas's modest new apartment. Inside was a single photograph. Henry, now 12 months old, sitting in a high chair, birthday cake smeared across his smiling face. No note, no return address. Just the image of his son, growing and thriving in a world that didn't include him. Douglas placed the photograph carefully on his bedside table, the first physical confirmation in a year that Henry truly existed beyond. The Polaroid taken at his birth. He didn't know if the photograph represented cruelty or kindness on Keely's part, but he chose to see it as the latter, a tiny window into the life he had forfeited. A reminder of what he was fighting to become worthy of. 3 days later, with 9 months of sobriety behind him, Douglas finally signed the divorce papers. He enclosed a letter that had taken weeks to write, knowing it might never reach Keely, needing to send it anyway. I sign these papers not because I accept losing you and Henry, but because I finally understand that my selfishness has cost enough. I will not drag you through legal battles or force you to look over your shoulder. You deserve peace, and Henry deserves a mother who isn't afraid. I don't ask for forgiveness. I haven't earned it. I don't ask to be part of your lives. I forfeited that right. I ask only that someday, when he's old enough to understand, you tell Henry that his father made the worst mistake a man can make, and has spent every day since trying to become someone better than the man who betrayed you both. I will be here, sober, working to repair what I've broken in myself, if you ever decide I deserve to know my son. Until then, I release you from the fear of being found. The investigators have been dismissed. The searching stops today. With love I didn't deserve and lost. Through my own failure, Douglas. He had no way of knowing if Goldman would forward the letter, no way of knowing if Keeley would read it if he did. But as Douglas sealed the envelope, containing the signed papers and his letter, he felt the first stirring of something he hadn't experienced in the year since the storm. Not hope exactly, but purpose. The man who had lost everything was finally beginning to understand what actually mattered. Whether Keeley and Henry ever returned to his life or not, Douglas was determined to become someone worthy of the family he had thrown away. Someone who would never again mistake self-indulgence for love, convenience for commitment, or passion for purpose. Somewhere across the country, his son was growing up without him. His wife was building a new life from the ashes of his betrayal. The least he could do was honor their absence by becoming the man they had deserved all along. Chapter 6. Reinvention. Henry, careful on those rocks, sweetheart, Keeley's voice carried across the misty Seattle beach as her 4-year-old son hopped from stone to stone, yellow rain boots splashing in tide pools. The Pacific Northwest morning wrapped them in its characteristic gray embrace, not gloomy, but soft and intimate. "Look, Mama," Henry called, squatting to examine something in a pool. "A star!" Keeley knelt beside him, where a perfect orange sea star lay against dark rocks. "It's a sea star. See how it has tiny tube feet underneath to help it move?" Henry nodded, his blue-grey eyes, so achingly familiar, wide with wonder. "Can we take it home?" "No, love. It belongs here in the ocean." Keeley stroked his cheek. "Everything has its place where it thrives best." They had found their place in Seattle's Ravenna neighborhood, in the sustainable community Keeley had designed 3 years ago. What had begun as desperate flight from Chicago had evolved into something unexpected, a genuine home, a thriving career, and the contentment of watching Henry grow in safety. Keeley's architectural firm, Phoenix Design, had established itself as an innovator in community-centered spaces. Her sustainable developments, incorporating shared gardens, childcare facilities, and workspaces, had garnered national attention. Critics praised her architecture of healing, spaces designed to foster connection and restoration. Few knew the philosophy had emerged from her own need to rebuild a shattered life. The first year had been hardest, sleepless nights with a newborn, constantly looking over her shoulder, fearing Douglas would track them down. She'd maintained almost paranoid levels of privacy, using only cash, avoiding social media, working remotely while establishing her new identity. Gradually, the fear receded. When Henry turned 1, she sent a photograph through Martin Goldman, a calculated risk, informing Douglas that Henry was thriving, testing whether he would escalate his search, and releasing some of the grief she still carried. When Douglas responded by signing the divorce papers and sending that unexpected letter, something shifted in Keeley. His promise to stop searching proved genuine. The investigators disappeared. The legal pressure ceased. The divorce was finalized. Without complications, She never responded to his letter, but kept it tucked away in a lockbox with Henry's birth certificate and the few photographs from her previous life she hadn't discarded. "Mama, I'm hungry," Henry declared, slipping his hand into hers. "Can we get cinnamon rolls at Miss Abby's?" Keely smiled. "That sounds perfect. Race you to the stairs?" As they climbed toward the neighborhood, Keely felt the familiar tug of contradiction. She had created a beautiful life, rich with meaningful work, supportive friends, and the joy of raising Henry. Yet sometimes, in quiet moments, she acknowledged the shadow across her heart. Her capacity to trust had been damaged, perhaps irreparably. Back home, Eleanor was watering plants on the balcony, her silver hair in a neat bun. At 80, Keely's godmother moved more slowly than once, but her mind remained sharp. She had been their salvation in those first desperate weeks, providing shelter, helping Keely establish professional connections, and creating a sense of family for Henry. "Did you find any treasures at the beach?" Eleanor asked as Henry burst through the door. "Sea stars and crabs and a big purple shell," Henry exclaimed, "and Mama said we can have cinnamon rolls for lunch." "After a proper sandwich," Keely amended, hanging their jackets. As Henry washed his hands, Eleanor gave Keely an appraising look. "You seem thoughtful today." Keely smiled wryly. Nothing escaped Eleanor. "Henry asked about his father again yesterday. More specific questions this time." Eleanor nodded. "He's at that age, noticing other family structures, comparing them to his own. I've always been honest with him in age-appropriate ways," Keely said quietly. "But lately he wants details I'm not sure how to provide. Such as why his father isn't in his life, whether he did something wrong that made his father leave." Keely's expression tightened. "I've told him it had nothing to do with him, that it was about adult problems, but those answers won't satisfy him much longer." Eleanor touched Keely's arm gently. "Perhaps it's time to consider whether complete severance serves Henry's needs as well as it served yours." The suggestion hung between them as Henry returned, announcing, "Daniel's coming." He pointed to the window where a tall figure approached. Daniel Foster, a pediatric surgeon at Seattle Children's Hospital, had entered their lives 2 years earlier, when Keely designed a healing garden for the oncology ward. His professional interest had gradually evolved into something more personal, though Keely had kept him firmly in the friend category, despite his patient interest in both her and Henry. The doorbell rang, and Henry raced to answer. Daniel stood there, his tall frame appearing even taller from Henry's perspective. At 41, he had the confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, salt and pepper hair cut short, laugh lines around kind eyes. "I heard there's an engineering marvel I need to inspect," he said, kneeling to Henry's level. "I made it with the special wood pieces," Henry replied, already pulling him toward his room. "It can hold 27 marbles before it breaks." Daniel glanced over his shoulder at Keely with a warm smile. "I've been summoned by the chief engineer. Back shortly." As they disappeared, Eleanor began preparing lunch. "That man is a saint," she observed. 2 years of your hesitation, and he's still showing up with the same steady warmth." "Daniel understands my situation," Keely replied, retrieving plates. "Your situation or your walls?" Eleanor countered gently. "There's a difference between caution and hiding, dear one." Before Keely could respond, her phone buzzed. Opening her email, she found an invitation from the Sustainable Urban Development Conference, requesting her as keynote speaker for their annual event in Chicago next month. Chicago, the city she had fled, where memories lurked on every corner, where Douglas might still live. Keely's finger hovered over the delete button before surprising herself by flagging the email instead. 5 years had passed. She had built a new life, established professional credibility, created stability for Henry. Perhaps it was time to reclaim the parts of herself she had left behind, not for Douglas, but for her own completion. "Good news?" Eleanor asked, noting her expression. "Potentially," Keely replied. "A speaking opportunity in Chicago." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "That would be a significant step. It's just a conference, Keely said, attempting to sound casual. A professional engagement. In the city you've avoided for 5 years, Eleanor pointed out, where Henry's father presumably still lives. Later, after lunch, when Henry was showing Eleanor his artwork and Daniel was helping Keely with the dishes, he nodded toward her. Yvonne, you seemed surprised by something in your email earlier. Nothing concerning, I hope. Keely hesitated, then decided on honesty. An invitation to speak at a conference in Chicago. Daniel's hands stilled momentarily. That would be your first time back since Henry was born, she confirmed. Since I left. Are you considering it? I'm not sure, Keely admitted. Logistically, it's complicated with Henry. Emotionally, it's more complicated. Daniel nodded, understanding without pressing. I could help with the logistics, if that would make it easier. Eleanor and I could manage Henry for a few days. His expression remained neutral. The emotional aspects, though, those are yours to navigate. His offer, practical, supportive, without pressure, exemplified why Daniel had gradually become important in their lives. Unlike Douglas's intensity, Daniel's care expressed itself through consistent respect for her autonomy. Thank you, she said simply. I'll think about it. That evening, after Daniel had gone and Henry was asleep, Keely sat on her balcony overlooking the community garden. Her tablet displayed her latest project, a healing center for trauma survivors, incorporating elements from natural landscapes, creating spaces that guided occupants from darkness toward light. A text message illuminated her phone. Daniel, checking whether she was free for coffee tomorrow. Keely hesitated before responding with a polite decline, citing project deadlines. As she returned to work, the conference invitation remained open in another tab, Chicago, next month. Eleanor's words echoed in her mind. Perhaps it's time to consider whether complete severance serves Henry's needs as well as it served yours. In her bedroom, Keely paused at the lockbox in her closet. Using the key she kept around her neck, she opened it and withdrew Douglas's letter, the only communication from him she'd kept. She hadn't read it in years, had almost forgotten his promise to become someone better than the man who betrayed you both. Had he? Was it even possible to transform so completely? The cynical part of her doubted it. Yet something, perhaps Eleanor's gentle prodding, perhaps Henry's increasingly specific questions, perhaps the unexpected pull of returning to Chicago, made her wonder. As she checked on Henry's peaceful sleep, Keely was struck by his resemblance to Douglas. The dark curls, the long eyelashes, the focused expression even in slumber. She had tried to outrun genetics as thoroughly as she had outrun her past, but biology had its own persistent truth. Someday, Henry would have questions she couldn't answer about the man whose blood ran in his veins. Someday, he would want more than the carefully edited version of their history she had provided. And when that day came, Keely would need to find forgiveness, not for Douglas's sake, but for Henry's, and perhaps finally, for her own. 3,000 miles away in Chicago, Douglas Smiths sat in a modest office reviewing case files of families seeking legal assistance. 4 years sober, he had rebuilt his career from the ground up, establishing a small practice focused on family advocacy and children's rights. The photograph of 1-year-old Henry remained on his desk, joined now by the only other image Keely had permitted Goldman to forward on Henry's 4th birthday, a distant shot of the boy flying a kite on a beach, face tilted toward the sky in perfect joy. Douglas had no illusions about reconciliation. The life he had destroyed could never be reconstructed. But he had transformed his pain into purpose, channeling his legal skills toward protecting the vulnerable, making amends through service where personal redemption remained beyond reach. A notification chimed on his computer, the annual list. of speakers for the Sustainable Communities Conference his firm sponsored as part of its pro bono initiatives. His eyes caught on a name halfway down the page, and his heart stuttered to a stop. Keynote address. Architecture as healing, designing spaces for renewal. Presenter, Keely Steele. Founder, Phoenix Design, Seattle. For the first time in 5 years, Douglas knew exactly where Keely would be on a specific date. The knowledge filled him not with the obsessive energy of his earlier searching, but with a quiet wonder tinged with trepidation. She was coming back to Chicago. After all this time, their paths would cross again, and somewhere in Seattle, their son was growing up with questions that only the two of them together could fully answer. Chapter 7. Collision Course. The Chicago skyline glittered beneath an autumn sky as Keely Steele's plane began its descent. Through the window, she could make out familiar landmarks: the Willis Tower, the Chicago River, Lake Michigan stretching toward the horizon. 5 years had passed since she'd last seen this view. Fleeing with newborn Henry cradled against her chest, her heart shattered by betrayal. Now she returned on her own terms. Successful, centered, secure in her identity, beyond the woman who had once been Douglas Smith's betrayed wife. The Sustainable Communities Conference had arranged a suite at the Drake Hotel, transportation, and a packed schedule. Her keynote address was scheduled for tomorrow. Architecture as healing, designing. Spaces for renewal. As the plane touched down, she reminded herself that Chicago was a city of nearly 3 million people. The chances of encountering Douglas were infinitesimal. She had not informed him of her visit, had not communicated with him directly in 5 years beyond the 2 photographs Martin Goldman had forwarded. There was no reason their paths would cross. Still, as she collected her luggage and stepped into the waiting car, Keely found herself scanning the crowd, her body tensed for a recognition she told herself wouldn't come. The Drake Hotel held its own memories, a charity gala where she'd received her first major architectural award, Douglas beaming proudly from their table. Now, stepping into the elegant lobby alone, Keely felt her former self superimposed over her present reality. That evening, at a speaker's dinner, she conversed easily with urban planners and developers, discussing sustainable design principles. No one mentioned her previous life in Chicago or her abrupt departure. In professional circles, she was simply Keely Steele, innovative architect from Seattle, founder of Phoenix Design. By afternoon the next day, Keely stood at the podium of the Grand Ballroom at the Chicago Architectural Foundation, her keynote. Address completed to enthusiastic applause. Her ideas about trauma-informed design had resonated with the audience of architects, urban planners, and community developers. And now we'll open the floor for questions, the moderator announced. As attendees approached microphones positioned throughout the room, Keely felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a charged awareness that raised the fine hairs on her arms. Her eyes moved instinctively toward the back of the ballroom, where a tall figure stood partially obscured by a column. Even at a distance, even after 5 years, she would know Douglas anywhere. The particular way he held himself, the angle of his shoulders, the dark hair now threaded with silver at the temples. He wasn't approaching a microphone, wasn't drawing attention to himself, simply standing, watching, his presence both jarring and somehow inevitable. Keely forced herself to focus on the questions being asked, to maintain her professional composure. When the session ended 20 minutes later, her eyes returned to the spot where Douglas had stood, but he was gone. "Ms. Steele, there's someone who'd like to speak with you privately," the event coordinator said, approaching with an apologetic smile. "He says it's important, but I can certainly ask him to reach out through proper channels if you prefer." Keely knew before asking. Did he give a name? Douglas Smith's. He mentioned he's connected to one of the conference sponsors. Of course, the connection she hadn't made, the Family Advocacy Foundation listed among the event's benefactors, bore the unmistakable hallmarks of Douglas's legal initiatives. "It's all right," Keely said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I'll speak with him briefly." The coordinator led her to a small meeting room. Douglas stood by the window, his back to the door. When he turned, Keely was struck by the changes 5 years had wrought. He was leaner, the tailored extravagance of his former wardrobe replaced by a simple charcoal suit. The most noticeable transformation was in his eyes, the sharp calculation replaced by something deeper, more grounded. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them seemed to crackle with the electricity of shared history, of love turned to betrayal, turned to absence. "You look well, Keely," Douglas finally said, his voice lower than she remembered. "Your presentation was brilliant." "Thank you," she replied, remaining near the door. "I didn't realize your foundation was involved with the conference. We've been supporting community design initiatives for the past 3 years. I didn't know you were speaking until the schedule was finalized last week." The implication was clear. He hadn't engineered this meeting. Somehow this knowledge allowed Keely to breathe more easily. "How is Henry?" Douglas asked, the question gentle but direct. Keely felt the familiar protective instinct rise, then consciously moderated it. "He's well. Growing quickly. Smart, curious, unkind." She paused. "He asks about you sometimes." Something flickered across Douglas's face. Hope, pain, gratitude. "What do you tell him?" "The truth, in ways he can understand. That you live far away, that you're his father, that families come in different forms." Keely moved further into the room. "I've shown him your photograph." Douglas nodded, visibly emotional. "Thank you for that, for not erasing me completely." "I couldn't if I tried," Keely said, not unkindly. "He has your eyes, your expressions sometimes, the way he focuses on things that interest him. That's all you." A silence fell between them. Douglas maintained his position by the window, careful not to crowd her. "I don't expect forgiveness, Keely," he said finally. "I don't deserve it. I just want you to know that the foundation's work, everything I've built in these years, it started as atonement, but it's become something more. Purpose." He hesitated. "The man you left no longer exists. I don't say that to request anything from you, only to acknowledge that your leaving forced me to confront who I had become." Keely studied him, measuring the sincerity in his words against her memory of broken promises. "I'm glad, Douglas. But it doesn't change what happened." "No," he agreed quietly. "Nothing can." The simple acknowledgement, free from manipulation, caught her off guard. The Douglas she had known would have argued, persuaded, attempted to reframe the narrative. This man seemed content simply to speak truth, however painful. "How long are you in Chicago?" he asked, changing the subject. 3 more days. I'm consulting on the Lakefront Community Project before returning to Seattle." Douglas nodded, a sad smile touching his lips. "Life has a particular symmetry, doesn't it? The Lakeside Cultural Center was where we first met." The memory surfaced with unexpected vividness, rain slicking down his face as he listened to her passionate defense of architectural integrity, the surprising connection that had sparked between them. "I should go," she said, gathering her portfolio. "I have a dinner meeting with the project developers." Douglas made no move to stop her, but his voice halted her at the door. "Keely, there's something you should know. I've been offered a position with the National Children's Advocacy Center in Seattle. I haven't accepted yet. I wanted to speak with you first. If my presence there would be disruptive to the life you've built, I'll decline." The revelation landed like a stone in still water, ripples of implication spreading outward. Douglas in Seattle. Douglas potentially within reach of Henry. Douglas honoring her enough to consult her before making a decision that could impact their carefully separate lives. "When would you need to decide?" she asked, her mind racing through possibilities. 2 weeks, Douglas replied. "It's a significant role, helping establish legal protections for children in vulnerable family situations." A shadow crossed his face. "The irony isn't lost on me. Advocating for families when I destroyed my own." Keeley considered him carefully. "I need time to think about this, to consider what it might mean for Henry." "Of course," Douglas said immediately. "I wouldn't presume." "But," she continued, surprising herself, "I don't think you should decline. Solely because of us. Seattle is a large city. We could establish boundaries, protocols." Hope flickered in Douglas's eyes, quickly tempered by caution. "I would respect any parameters you set, Keeley. Absolutely." She nodded, her hand on the doorknob. "I'm staying at the Drake. I'll contact you before I leave Chicago with my thoughts." As she walked away, Keeley's mind raced with conflicting emotions. The man she had just spoken with was simultaneously familiar and foreign, the physical form of Douglas Smith's inhabited by someone demonstrably changed. She had expected to feel rage upon seeing him again, or perhaps nothing at all. Instead, she felt something more complex, a cautious recognition that the person who had caused such devastation was no longer present in the man who now bore his name. That evening, Douglas jogged along the lakefront path, pushing himself harder than usual, trying to outrun the turbulence of emotions Keeley's presence had awakened. She was still breathtaking. Her beauty matured into something more profound, her professional confidence evident in every gesture. His phone vibrated with a text message from an unknown number. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Millennium Park, North Garden. I'll have an hour before my next meeting." Kay Douglas stopped running, staring at the message. Keeley had reached out, had created an opportunity for further conversation. After 5 years of silence, after the devastation he had caused, she was offering, not forgiveness, perhaps, but at least the possibility of moving beyond the frozen moment of betrayal. When Douglas returned to his hotel, he found himself reaching for his laptop, pulling up a folder of scanned artwork that Henry had created over the years. Among them was a simple stick figure drawing labeled "My Family." A small figure, Henry, stood beside a taller one, Keeley, with a third figure drawn in clouds above, labeled "My Dad in Heaven." The image struck Douglas with physical force. His son believed him dead, a fiction perhaps kinder than the truth of his betrayal, but devastating nonetheless. He downloaded the image and had it printed, carefully placing it in a folder to bring to their meeting. When he arrived at Millennium Park the next morning, Keeley was already there, sitting on a bench near the North Garden, wrapped in a camel-colored coat against the October chill. "Thank you for agreeing to meet again," Douglas said, taking a seat at a respectful distance. "I've been thinking about your Seattle opportunity," Keeley replied directly, "about what it might mean for Henry." "Before we discuss that," she continued, "and there's something I need to understand. Why did you choose her that night, with everything at stake, your marriage, your child being born? How could you silence your phone and stay with her?" The question hung between them in the crisp morning air. Douglas didn't deflect or minimize. "There's no answer that could possibly be adequate," he said finally. "The simple truth is that I was a selfish, broken man who had convinced himself that momentary escape mattered more than lasting commitment. I betrayed everything I claimed to value because I was afraid of failing as a father, afraid of the vulnerability that comes with true love, afraid of living up to the person you believed me to be." Keeley listened without interruption. When Douglas finished, she was silent for a long moment. "I believe you," she said finally, "that you understand what you did, that you've changed." She looked away. "But understanding doesn't undo the damage." "No," Douglas agreed, "it doesn't." Keely withdrew a folded paper from her pocket and handed it to him. "Henry drew this last week before I left." Douglas unfolded the paper. The drawing showed 3 stick figures labeled Mom, me, and my dad. "In heaven," his throat tightened. "I've never told him you were dead," Keely said quietly. "But at school, when other children talk about absent fathers, that's the conclusion he's drawn, that you must be in heaven, because otherwise you would. Be with us. How do I tell him you chose not to die? You chose not to be his father?" Keely asked, her voice holding no accusation, just the weight of a question that had no simple answer. The devastating directness of her words left Douglas momentarily speechless. "You don't have to tell him anything, Keely. That burden shouldn't be yours." He met her gaze steadily. "If you decide to allow me into Henry's life, in whatever limited way you deem appropriate, I'll take responsibility for explaining my absence in terms he can understand, in a way that never blames you or makes him feel unwanted." Keely studied him. "And if I decide against it, if I ask you to decline the Seattle position, then I'll respect that decision completely," Douglas replied without hesitation. "Henry's well-being comes first. Your peace of mind comes first. My career is secondary to both." This simple prioritization, so different from the ambitious attorney who had once placed career above everything, seemed to reach Keely in a way nothing else had. "If you move to Seattle," she said finally, "we would need to establish very clear boundaries. Any contact with Henry would begin slowly, carefully, supervised visits in public places, no disclosure of your identity until I determine he's ready." Hope rose in Douglas's chest, but he kept his expression measured. "Of course, whatever parameters you set." "I'm not promising anything," Keely cautioned. "This would be an experiment, subject to immediate termination if it causes Henry any confusion or distress." "I understand completely," Douglas assured her. "I would follow your lead in every aspect." Keely stood, signaling the end of their meeting. "I'll contact you before I leave Chicago with my final decision." As she turned to go, Douglas found himself speaking once more. "Keely, thank you. Not just for considering this, but for creating such a remarkable life for Henry, for being the parent I failed to be." She paused, something softening briefly in her expression. "He's worth every sacrifice. Never forget that, Douglas." "I won't," he promised. "Not ever again." Chapter 8. The Education of Douglas Smiths. The modest apartment in Madison Park reflected Douglas's new priorities: simple furniture, uncluttered spaces, walls adorned only with 2 framed photographs of Henry that Keely had permitted Goldman to forward over the years. This deliberate minimalism wasn't financial necessity, but a hard-won understanding of what truly mattered. 3 weeks after relocating to Seattle, Douglas stood at his kitchen window, coffee cooling in his hands, waiting for Goldman's call about Keely's decision regarding supervised contact with Henry. When his phone finally rang, Goldman's voice carried neither warmth nor coldness, just professional precision. "She's agreed to a preliminary meeting. Saturday, 10 a.m., Volunteer Park. 30 minutes, no more. She'll introduce you as a friend from Chicago who works with children. No mention of paternity." "I understand," Douglas replied, his heart racing. Despite his measured tone, "Please tell her I'm grateful for this opportunity." Saturday morning, Douglas arrived early, finding a bench with clear sightlines to all approaching paths. When they appeared, Keely walking hand in hand with a small boy in a red jacket, Douglas remained seated, allowing them to approach at their own pace. The first clear view of Henry's face struck him physically, a recognition so profound it momentarily robbed him of breath. "Good morning," Keely said, her tone deliberately neutral. "Henry, this is the friend from Chicago I mentioned. Mr. Smiths works with children who need help with legal problems." Douglas smiled, crouching to Henry's level but maintaining a respectful distance. "You can call me Douglas. It's nice to meet you, Henry." The boy studied him with remarkable focus, his eyes, Douglas's eyes, serious and assessing. Do you help kids in trouble? I try to, Douglas answered honestly. Sometimes children need adults to make sure they're treated fairly. Henry nodded decisively. That's important. Kids need fair turns on the swings, too. The half-hour passed too quickly. As they walked through the park, Henry pointed out his favorite climbing tree, while Douglas responded with appropriate interest, carefully avoiding any behavior that might seem like overreaching. When Henry ran ahead to examine a rock formation, Douglas spoke quietly to Keely. "Thank you for this. I know how difficult it must be." She nodded, watching their son. "This is a test, Douglas, one of many. I need to see that you understand your role is whatever I determine it to be, nothing more." "I understand completely," he replied without hesitation. "I forfeited any right to expectations 5 years ago." When Henry returned with a pine cone, Keely checked her watch. "Time to go, sweetheart. We're meeting Eleanor for lunch." Henry's disappointment was evident, but fleeting. "Bye, Douglas. Maybe I'll see you another time." "I'd like that," Douglas replied, keeping his tone light despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. As they walked away, Douglas remained on the bench, allowing the full impact of the encounter to wash over him. For 5 years, Henry had been an abstraction. Now he was real, a person with opinions and preferences, moving through the world with no awareness of his impact on the man who had just met him. In the months that followed, Douglas earned each small increment of trust through absolute consistency. The park meetings became weekly, then twice weekly, casual encounters governed by Keely's careful orchestration. Douglas never pushed for more time, never arrived with inappropriate gifts, never made reference to their connection unless Keely directly addressed it. Each encounter revealed new facets of what he had sacrificed. Henry's preference for strawberry ice cream but dislike of strawberry jam, his fascination with bridges, his serious consideration of questions before answering. Douglas documented these discoveries mentally, building a catalogue of the son he was just beginning to know. The true measure of what he had lost came during their 9th meeting, as they constructed an elaborate sandcastle in the playground. Henry had been unusually quiet, his small face serious as he packed wet sand into shape. "Douglas," he said suddenly, looking up with an expression too grave for a 5-year-old. "Did you know other kids before me?" "What do you mean?" Douglas asked, giving Henry his full attention. "Kids you helped," Henry clarified. "With your lawyer work." "Yes," Douglas answered. "Many children." Henry nodded, returning to his sand construction. "Did you like them?" Douglas set aside his sand tools, recognizing the importance of this moment. "I cared about helping them. But it's different with you, Henry." The boy's eyes lifted again, searching Douglas's face. "Why?" Douglas glanced toward Keely on a nearby bench, her slight nod granting permission to navigate this territory. "Because you're special," Douglas said carefully. "Getting to know you has been the greatest gift of my life." Henry considered this, thoughtful beyond his years. "Did you not want to know me when I was a baby?" The question landed like a physical blow, its innocent directness cutting to the heart of everything. Douglas fought to maintain his composure, aware of the monumental importance of his answer. "Henry," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "when you were a baby, I made the worst mistake a person can make. I hurt your mother very badly. I wasn't the kind of person who deserved to know someone as wonderful as you." He paused, searching for words a 5-year-old could comprehend. "I've spent every day since then trying to become better, kinder, more honest, more worthy of being in your life." Henry studied him, absorbing the answer with a child's intuitive understanding. "Did you say sorry?" "Many times," Douglas answered, softly. "But some mistakes are so big that sorry isn't enough. You have to prove you've changed by how you live, by the choices you make every day." Henry nodded. "That's what Mom says too. When I broke her special vase and said sorry, she said I needed to show I was sorry by being more careful with fragile things." "Your mom is very wise," Douglas said, meeting Keely's gaze across the playground, noting the shimmer of unshed tears in her eyes. Later, as they prepared to leave, Keely spoke quietly while Henry collected his toys. "You could have lied. Made yourself look better. I promise never to lie to either of you again," Douglas replied simply. "Whatever relationship I might someday have with Henry has to be built on absolute truth, however painful." Something shifted in Keely's expression. Not forgiveness, but perhaps recognition that the man before her truly was different from the one who had betrayed her. "Next Saturday," she said after a moment, "Henry's school is having a science fair. He's built a model of the Lake Washington floating bridge. If you'd like to attend, as a family friend, that would be acceptable." "I'd be honored," he said, matching her neutral tone while his heart thundered in his chest. The science fair allowed Douglas to glimpse the world Keely had constructed for Henry, a sustainable community where neighbors shared childcare, communal gardens where Henry had his own plot, shared spaces fostering connection while respecting privacy. It was Keely's philosophy made tangible, her response to trauma translated into architecture that healed. As other families circulated through the gymnasium, Douglas was introduced simply as Mr. Smith's, a family friend from Chicago. One mother, watching him help Henry demonstrate his bridge model, commented to Keely, "It's nice that Henry has a male figure in his life. Is he a relative?" "He's Henry's father," Keely said quietly, the simple truth shocking in its directness. "We're navigating a complicated situation for Henry's benefit." The brief exchange, overheard as Douglas pretended to focus on Henry's explanation, sent a tremor through him. The first time Keely had acknowledged their connection publicly. Later, as they walked to their cars, Henry skipping ahead with his ribbon, Keely addressed what had happened. "I'm tired of constructing elaborate fictions," she said. "It doesn't serve Henry to build his understanding of family on falsehoods, no matter how well-intentioned." "What does this mean?" Douglas asked carefully. "I don't know yet," Keely admitted. "But I think we need to consider telling him the truth. Soon, in a way that protects him from unnecessary pain while giving him what he needs, clarity about who you are, who we are to each other." "I'll follow your lead completely," Douglas managed. "Whatever approach you think best." "I know you will," Keely replied. And in those three simple words lay recognition of the essential difference between the man he had been and the one he had become. In the weeks that followed, Douglas's integration into Henry's life progressed with careful deliberation. Throughout these expanding interactions, he maintained absolute respect for Keely's boundaries, never arriving unannounced, never extending visits beyond the agreed time frame, never attempting to curry favor with extravagant gifts. The corporate attorney, who had once measured success in billable hours, now found profound satisfaction in helping a 5-year-old master the principles of structural support in a tower of blocks, in witnessing the moment understanding dawned in eyes so like his own. That evening, after returning Henry home, Keely invited Douglas inside for the first time. The interior reflected her architectural sensibility. Clean lines softened by natural materials, spaces that flowed logically. "I think telling Henry should come from both of us," Keely said directly as they sat at her kitchen table. "A unified message that this isn't a choice between us, that he isn't being disloyal to me by knowing you." "How do we explain why I wasn't in his life until now?" Douglas asked. "With age-appropriate truth," Keely replied, "that you made a mistake that hurt me deeply, that you needed to become a better person before you could be part of his life. No details he can't understand, but no fiction either." The approach reflected Keely's inherent wisdom about their son's needs. Once again, Douglas found himself humbled by her capacity to prioritize Henry's well-being above resentment she had. "Every right to maintain when?" he asked simply. "Next weekend," Keely decided. "We'll take him to the waterfront park he loves. Neutral territory, a place he associates with happiness." As Douglas prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Thank you, Keely. Not just for this decision, but for everything you've given Henry. This home, this community, this sense of security." "I didn't do it for you," she replied, her tone not unkind but clear in its boundaries. "I know," Douglas acknowledged. "You did it despite me, despite what I did to both of you. That's what makes it all the more remarkable." Driving home, Douglas felt the weight of the coming conversation, the responsibility of helping their son understand his absence without damaging his sense of self-worth. It was the ultimate test of whether he had truly become someone worthy of the title father. The education of Douglas Smiths had begun with loss, progressed through reckoning, and now approached its most profound lesson, that true fatherhood had nothing to do with legal rights and everything to do with consistent presence, with prioritizing a child's needs above one's own desires, with the daily choice to be worthy of a trust that had to be earned rather than assumed. Chapter 9. Fault Lines Revisited. The autumn rain fell in gentle persistence as Keely stood at Eleanor's hospital bedside, her godmother's frail hand clasped between her own. What had begun as a minor stroke 3 days earlier had revealed more extensive damage, decades of high blood pressure exacting its toll on the 80-year-old woman who had become Henry's surrogate grandmother and Keely's anchor in Seattle. "You should go home and rest," Eleanor whispered, her speech slightly slurred but her gaze still sharp. "Henry needs you more than I do." "Henry is fine," Keely assured her, smoothing the thin hospital blanket. "He's with Miss Abby from next door. We're taking shifts until you're better." Eleanor's smile held knowing wisdom. Always the architect, building systems and supports. Her eyes drifted toward the window, then back to Keely's face. "Have you told Douglas about my condition?" The question caught Keely off guard. In the 8 months since Douglas had re-entered their lives, Eleanor had watched their careful negotiation of boundaries with quiet observation, offering neither judgment nor advice. Her direct reference to him now felt significant. "No," Keely replied. "It hasn't come up during our scheduled meetings." Eleanor's expression turned gently chiding. "The man has proven himself consistent for nearly a year, Keely. He's earned at least the courtesy of knowing about a family emergency." "You're not his family," Keely said automatically, though the words lacked conviction. "But Henry is," Eleanor countered, "and Henry loves me. Therefore, by the transitive property of emotional mathematics—" She trailed off with a weak smile. The consideration became necessity the following morning when Henry's school called. A scheduling mix-up with the substitute teacher meant all children needed pickup by noon. With Eleanor still hospitalized and Keely in the middle of critical client meetings she couldn't reschedule, her carefully constructed support system revealed its vulnerability. After exhausting other options, Keely found herself calling the number she had gradually come to associate with reliable help, if not yet comfort. "Douglas, it's Keely. I have a situation." He responded without hesitation, the background noise suggesting he was at his office. "What do you need?" The simple question, direct, without agenda, made this easier. "Eleanor is in the hospital with a stroke. I'm in back-to-back client meetings I can't reschedule. Henry's school called for early pickup due to a staffing issue. I wouldn't ask, but text me the school address and Henry's teacher's name." Douglas interrupted gently. "I'll handle it. Would you like me to bring him to my apartment or take him somewhere else?" In that moment, Keely recognized how profoundly their dynamic had shifted from carefully orchestrated meetings to genuine reliance. "If you could bring him to the hospital, Eleanor would like to see him." "Of course," Douglas replied simply. "Whatever works best for Henry." 2 hours later, as Keely hurried through the hospital corridors toward Eleanor's room, she found Douglas sitting in the visitor's lounge outside, Henry beside him working intently on homework. They hadn't noticed her yet, giving her a moment. to observe their interaction, Douglas's patient guidance, Henry's comfortable acceptance of his presence. The scene jarred her perception of what she'd thought their relationship would be. "Mom!" Henry spotted her first, racing toward her with his workbook. "Douglas picked me up from school and we got lunch and then we came to see Grandma Eleanor." Over Henry's head, Keely met Douglas's gaze, finding nothing there but calm reassurance, no triumph at this unplanned extension of his role, no expectation of gratitude, just steady presence in a moment of need. "Thank you," she said simply as Henry returned to gather his things, "for dropping everything." "Of course," Douglas replied, his tone conveying that no other response had ever been possible. In the days that followed, Eleanor's condition worsened. When she was finally discharged, it was to Keely's home rather than her own apartment, necessitating further adjustments to all their lives. Douglas stepped into each gap seamlessly, driving Eleanor to therapy appointments while Keely presented, at a design conference, helping Henry with school projects when work deadlines loomed, maintaining a steady presence that asked nothing beyond the privilege of being useful. The night Eleanor died, peacefully in her sleep 6 weeks after her stroke, it was Douglas who answered Keely's 3 a.m. call, arriving at her home within 20 minutes to sit with Henry while she managed the necessary arrangements. In the quiet kitchen, as paramedics respectfully removed Eleanor's body, he made tea neither of them would drink and simply waited, offering the gift of silent companionship through the dark hours before dawn. The memorial service gathered the community Eleanor had embraced in her final years. Douglas stood at the periphery, understanding his place as a supportive presence rather than family. It was Henry who changed this choreography, slipping from Keely's side to take Douglas's hand and pull him forward. "You should stand with us," he said with a child's direct logic. "Grandma Eleanor liked you." When Keely's voice failed midway through her eulogy, the memories overwhelming her carefully maintained composure, Douglas stepped forward without prompting, taking the paper from her trembling hands and continuing where she had left off. His voice, steady and respectful, carried her words to the gathered mourners, while his hand rested lightly against her back, providing support without constraint. That evening, after the guests had departed and Henry had finally fallen into exhausted sleep, Keely found Douglas in Eleanor's garden behind the house. The small plot had been her godmother's pride. Roses and herbs, the Japanese maple she had nurtured from a sapling, the stone bench where she had spent countless hours with Henry. "You should go home and rest," Douglas said, echoing Eleanor's words from the hospital. "You've been taking care of everyone else all day." Keely shook her head, sinking onto the bench beside him. "I'm not ready to be inside yet. The house feels empty." They sat in silence as darkness settled around them, the garden transforming in the gathering shadows. When Keely finally spoke, her voice emerged with a rawness she hadn't permitted herself to display throughout the carefully managed day. "She was the only parent I had left, the only one who knew me before all of this, before Chicago, before you, before everything fell apart." Douglas nodded, understanding the particular grief of losing the last witness to one's earlier self. "She was extraordinary. The way she helped you rebuild your life here, the foundation she helped create for Henry." "She never judged me," Keely continued, the words beginning to flow more freely. "Not for leaving Chicago so abruptly, not for cutting off everyone from our previous life, not for keeping Henry from you all those years." She looked at him directly. "But she also never thought I should keep him from you forever. She was the one who encouraged me to read your letter, to consider what Henry might someday need that I couldn't provide alone." "She was very perceptive," Douglas acknowledged softly. "When we spoke privately at the hospital, she told me something I'll never forget. She said, 'Keely builds walls better than any architect I know.' But she designed them with windows for a reason, even if she doesn't realize it yet. The metaphor, so characteristic of Eleanor's wisdom, brought a sad smile to Keely's face, as if the admission had unlocked something long suppressed. She felt the careful control she had maintained throughout the day beginning to crumble. The grief of losing Eleanor collided with older griefs. Her parents, her marriage, the life in Chicago she had fled, the years of vigilant self-protection that had kept her isolated despite her outward success. She was the only one who knew. "Everything," Keely whispered, her voice breaking. "About how much I loved you, about how completely you destroyed me, about how terrified I've been to trust anything since then." The first sob caught her by surprise, a violent, unwilling surrender to emotions she had contained for years. Once begun, the release could not be stopped. Years of carefully managed pain poured out in Eleanor's garden. Rage and grief intermingled, the accumulated weight of betrayal and loss finally finding expression. Douglas made no move to touch her, to offer facile comfort or easy absolution. He simply remained present, bearing witness to her pain with unflinching attention, his own tears falling silently as she finally unleashed the full force of what his betrayal had cost her. "You destroyed everything we built," she said, the words emerging between ragged breaths. "Our home, our future, my ability to trust, Henry's right to a complete family. You threw it all away for what? For her? For some pathetic escape from responsibility? Was it worth it, Douglas? Was it worth destroying everything?" The questions, raw and direct and 5 years overdue, hung in the night air between them. Douglas made no attempt to defend himself, to contextualize or minimize. His response, when it finally came, held nothing but absolute accountability. "No," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "Nothing could ever be worth the pain I caused you. Nothing could justify betraying the most precious gifts I'd ever received. Your trust, your love, our family." He turned toward her fully, his expression stripped of any pretense or self-protection. "I destroyed something beyond measure, Keely. There is no excuse, no justification. I was selfish and insecure and weak, and I threw away everyone and everything that mattered." The unadorned admission, free from qualification or subtle self-justification, seemed to release something in both of them. Keely's sobs gradually subsided, exhaustion replacing the storm of emotion. When she finally spoke again, her voice was steadier, though drained of energy. "I need to check on Henry." Douglas nodded, rising immediately. "Of course, I should go, unless there's anything else you need tonight." The consideration in the question, always prioritizing her needs and boundaries above his own desire for connection, struck Keely with sudden clarity. This man, who had once shattered her world through supreme selfishness, had reconstructed himself around an entirely different principle: service without expectation. "Would you mind driving me to the funeral home tomorrow?" she asked. The request, representing a choice to include him in the intimate duties of grief, rather than just the practical logistics of daily life. "There are arrangements to finalize, and I'd appreciate not doing it alone." "Of course," Douglas replied, understanding the significance of what she was offering. "Whatever you need, whenever you need it." At her front door, he hesitated before leaving. "Keely, there's something I should tell you. I've been offered a position with the National Children's Advocacy Coalition, the directorship of their legal division. It would mean relocating to Chicago." The information landed with unexpected impact, disturbing the fragile new equilibrium they had been establishing. "When would you leave?" she asked, working to keep her voice neutral. "I haven't accepted," Douglas said, his gaze steady on hers. "It's my dream role professionally, but I told them I needed to consider all the implications. Henry's stability comes first. Your peace of mind comes first." "So you'd decline your perfect career opportunity to stay in Seattle?" Keely questioned, the disbelief evident in her tone. "Why?" Douglas's answer held the simple certainty of a truth long understood. Because some things matter more than career advancement. Because being part of Henry's life, even in the limited way you've permitted, means more than any professional achievement. The selfless clarity of his priority, so different from the ambitious corporate attorney who had once placed career above everything, left Keely momentarily speechless. After 5 years of protecting herself against further harm from this man, she now faced the unsettling recognition that he had genuinely transformed into someone who would sacrifice his own interests for hers and Henry's without hesitation. "We'll talk about it tomorrow," she said finally, unable to process this new development through the fog of grief and emotional exhaustion. "Thank you for today, for all of it." As Douglas walked to his car, Keely remained in the doorway, watching him go. Eleanor's words from weeks earlier echoed in her mind. The man has spent 5 years remaking himself into someone worthy of you and Henry. Why are you still so surprised when he demonstrates it? Inside, as she checked on Henry's peaceful sleep, Keely confronted the truth she had been avoiding through years of careful distance and protected boundaries. The most frightening possibility wasn't that Douglas remained the man who had betrayed her. It was that he had genuinely become someone entirely different, someone worthy of the trust she had thought herself incapable of extending ever again. In the quiet of Eleanor's room, surrounded by the possessions of the woman who had helped her rebuild from devastation, Keely whispered the admission she had shared with no one. "I'm more afraid of forgetting why I shouldn't trust him than I am of remembering why I loved him." Chapter 10. What Love Rebuilds. Sunlight streamed through the windows of Keely's Seattle home, casting warm patterns across the living room floor where Henry arranged colorful streamers for his 7th birthday party. 1 year had passed since Eleanor's death, a year of profound transformation for all of them. "Mum, when will the guests arrive?" Henry called, standing back to assess his decorations with critical attention. "Not for another hour," Keely replied, emerging from the kitchen with a tray of fruit being prepared for the celebration. "We have plenty of time to finish setting up." The doorbell rang, drawing Henry's immediate attention. "Someone's early." "That's probably Douglas," Keely explained, setting down her tray. "He wanted to help with the preparations." Henry ran to open the door, his face brightening at the sight of his father standing on the porch with a large, carefully wrapped package. The transition from Douglas to Dad had evolved naturally over the past year, as his role in their lives expanded, from scheduled visitor to consistent, reliable presence. As Douglas helped Henry unwrap his gift, an elaborate wooden architectural model with 3 distinct structures connected by glass walkways, Keely watched them from the doorway, struck by the thoughtfulness of Douglas's creation. Not one unified home, erasing their separate journeys, but connected spaces honoring their individual identities while creating pathways between them. "It's your vision of a possible future," she said quietly to Douglas as Henry explored the models. "Moving parts." He nodded, meeting her gaze with characteristic directness. "Not a return to what was, but something new that honors where we've been." The birthday celebration unfolded with joyful chaos, and by evening, as the last guests departed, Henry had crashed from his sugar high, falling asleep on the sofa. Douglas carried him to bed with practiced tenderness, while Keely followed, watching from the doorway as he tucked the blankets around their sleeping son. When he emerged, closing the door softly, she handed him a glass of wine and led him to the porch swing overlooking her garden. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine as they sat in comfortable silence, shoulders nearly touching. "I've been reading your journal," Keely said finally, referring to the 5 years of entries he'd given her the night of Eleanor's funeral. "I didn't want to feel anything for you again." Douglas remained silent, giving her space to continue. His patience, so different from the driven ambition that had once characterized him, was just one measure of how profoundly he had changed. 5 years, she continued, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. For 5 years, I've been waiting for you to give me a reason to keep hating you, but you've given me every reason to forgive you instead. She turned to face him directly, allowing herself to truly see the man before her. Not the shadow of betrayal she had carried for so long, but someone who had rebuilt himself completely through painful, honest reckoning. I've been offered a commission in Chicago, she revealed. A community design near where we first met. The synchronicity hung between them, both meaningful and frightening in its implications. Douglas absorbed this information carefully. When would you go? That depends, Keely replied, her heartbeat quickening. I haven't decided if I'm going alone. She watched, understanding dawn in his eyes, the first glimmer of a possibility neither had dared articulate. Douglas reached into his pocket and withdrew a hotel keycard, the same one from the Peninsula Hotel where he had destroyed their marriage 6 years earlier. I've carried this every day since, he said, his voice rough with emotion, as a reminder of what selfishness cost me, of what I threw away. Keely took it from him, their fingers brushing in a contact that sent electricity through her veins. Without hesitation, she walked to the garden fire pit and struck a match. As the plastic keycard melted in the flames, she turned to him with tears streaming down her face. I forgive you, Douglas. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. His careful composure broke as he wept openly, never having expected this gift. When Keely stepped toward him, closing the physical distance between them as she had gradually closed the emotional one, Douglas remained perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might shatter this fragile moment. 3 months later, as they prepared to relocate to Chicago for her project, Keely invited Douglas to dinner at her home. After Henry went to bed, she unrolled the blueprints for her Chicago design across the table, a community of interconnected buildings surrounding a central garden. There's something missing, she said, leading him to the master bedroom wing. She unfolded a separate blueprint showing a space clearly designed for 2. I'm not asking for promises, she said, her voice trembling. I'm asking if you'd consider building something new with us, step by step, day by day. Douglas crossed the room slowly, giving her time to retreat. When she remained, he took her face in his hands with reverent tenderness. Loving you and Henry has been the only true purpose I've ever known, he whispered. Even when I had no right to call you mine, you've been my home. Their first kiss in over 6 years began tentatively, then deepened with the passion of everything unspoken between them. Years of longing, of growth, of separate journeys, converging in this single moment of reconnection. His hands tangled in her hair as hers pulled him closer, the physical chemistry between them as powerful as it had been that first rainy day on the construction site. Later, wrapped in each other's arms, Douglas confessed his fear of failing her again. Keely placed his hand over her heart and whispered, "The man who betrayed me no longer exists. I see who you've become, who we've both become. This time, we build our love with eyes wide open." 1 year later, they stood together at the groundbreaking of her architectural masterpiece in Chicago. As Henry ran ahead to place his handprints in the fresh concrete foundation, Douglas looked to Keely with uncertainty. She took his hand, a deliberate touch brimming with promise, and led him to the wet concrete. As they pressed their hands into the foundation side by side, connected through Henry's smaller prints between them, Douglas whispered, "Is this real?" Keely met his gaze directly, the walls finally down, her heart fully open. "Nothing is guaranteed, but this time we're building on truth instead of illusion. And I've learned that's the only foundation worth having." As Henry threw his arms around their waists, connecting them physically, Keely leaned against Douglas's shoulder, sealing their renewed commitment with a kiss that held not just passion, but the hard-won wisdom of 2 people who had learned that Love, true love, is not found in perfect beginnings, but in the courage to rebuild from ashes, stronger and more beautiful than before.